I did something recently I've never done in my entire life. I went to an eye doctor, and sure enough, they ordered some glasses for me. They came in this week. I'm still trying to get used to them. Nurse Linda said I had to wear them all the time to get used to them, so that's what I'm doing. But they tell me they are progressive lens, right? Which means when I look at my big black pickup, I see a Prius. I don't know. It's kind of funny, really. I saw something else interesting this week, and that was something about the word hierarchy. Hierarchy. I discovered that literally the word refers to a division of angels, with the archangels being at the top of the hierarchy. Archangels, hierarchy. Never saw that connection before, but with these glasses, I see everything. Now, hierarchy is not just about angels. We use that word in reference to a ruling body of clergy or any kind of church government situation. Anybody in authority is somewhere on a hierarchy. We simply classify people in all kinds of settings based on their abilities, their socioeconomic status, their professional standing, or whatever. So anything that is graded or ranked is considered to be part of a hierarchy. Now, I'm reminded of Maslow's hierarchy of needs that many of us studied in school. You remember you had the bottom level of needs was survival. That was, the base level of need on the hierarchy. But the very top of the hierarchy was what Maslow called self-actualization. And my feeling is whenever I actually become self-actualized, I'm going to retire, buy a cabin in the woods, and that'll be it. I mean, that's the end, right? Speaking of the pursuit of self-actualization, my son-in-law, Matt, just rejoined the Navy for another 6 years, and I asked him if this meant that he was on his way to becoming an admiral. And I said that would be a very admirable thing to do if he did. And I know corny jokes. This is it. This is the last one. But think about it. It would put him near the top of the Navy's hierarchy. Now, the church, of course, is noted for its hierarchies. Some are more hierarchical than others. For example, the Roman Catholic Church is a very hierarchical institution. You have a pope, followed by cardinals and bishops and priests and deacons, lay people. The nuns are in there somewhere. Not sure where. They're trying to get a little higher up, I think. And some Protestant groups are more hierarchical than others. You've got some that have bishops, for example, like the Anglicans and the Lutherans and the Methodists. So they have a system, a hierarchical system. Now contrast that with the United Church of Christ. We are relatively non-hierarchical because most of the power resides in the local church, not in a national office or a conference office, but in the local church. Other than the local church, there is a significant amount of power on the association level where we have our committees on ministry, and these are the people that sort of decide the fate of the ordination standing of a clergy, the standing of a church in the association. So there is some power there. So hierarchy, when you look around, it just is. It's a fact of life. We gather ourselves that way. We organize ourselves in that way in many settings. But again, going back to the original definition of hierarchy, it referred to a division, a classification of angels. According to a field of study called angelology, I kid you not, that is a field of study, angels have different ranks. And those with a higher rank have greater authority than those who have a lower rank. And this is true all across, especially the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For example, the ancient Jewish scholar Maimonides, he said there are 10 ranks of angels, which is a nice round number, 10. According to medieval Christian scholars or theologians, the angels, they said, are organized into several orders, which they called angelic choirs, because angels are said to have, good voices. They have angelic voices. We saw a reference to this in our first hymn this morning in verse 2. If you go back and look at it in a moment, you'll see a reference to the angelic choirs. Now, choir, what this says to me is that on your choir robes, you need some wings, because you're our angels. And guess where the choir is? It's up in the angel loft, right? Exactly. Thomas Aquinas, who is the father of the modern Catholic Church, he said that there are 3 hierarchies of angels, and with each hierarchy containing 3 orders or choirs. And then finally, some Islamic scholars suggest that there are 14 categories of angels, which I don't know where they get that or where any of them get anything, but that's kind of interesting. But again, the ones who are at the top of the hierarchy, those are the archangels. Kind of makes sense, right? Now, in our readings today, all 3 of our readings, we see hierarchy at play. For example, in the book of Job, we read that some heavenly beings, those are the words used, heavenly beings, they go to see God one day. They walk into God's office. Apparently God had an open door policy. And presumably these heavenly beings are angels, because that's who hangs out with God, right? They're angels of the highest order. So I'm sure we can assume these are archangels. Now there's one angel in particular that sort of stood out in the crowd. He seems to be the spokesperson for these archangels. His name is Satan. The real way to pronounce that is Satan. And I know it's difficult. You may have heard of that name before, but it's difficult to think of the Satan or Satan as a member of God's heavenly council, but there he is. There he is. And the Satan must have had a reputation for creating havoc among people. In fact, the word Satan means the accuser. Sort of his role. He's sort of like God's hatchet man, right? And Satan says, after God says, I know somebody who is blameless and upright. His name is Job, and nothing you can do to him is going to make him an unfaithful person to me. And Satan basically says, well, let me do something to him. I will cause him all manner of suffering, and then he will curse you. And God says, I'll take that bet. And he does. And so after Satan brings all kinds of suffering to Job, Job persists in his faithfulness to God, although his wife wants him to curse God so that he can just go ahead and die. I'm sure his wife is tired of all this, because she's affected by all this too. She's having to care for him. He's got stuff all over his skin from head to toe. It's like, why don't you just go ahead and die? Just curse God. God will kill you, and that'll be the end of it. And Job refers to her after that as a foolish woman. Now let's call that what it is. It's a sexist remark, right? But notice the hierarchy within the heavenly council. That's what I want to bring your attention to, with the Satan or Satan playing a leading role. Now, our mythology about Satan obviously changes as time goes on. When we get to the New Testament, he's not quite the angelic figure. Now, the letter to the Hebrews, this speaks of a hierarchy much more directly. I'll just summarize it for you. First, concerning God's Son, we are told that he was so high up in God's hierarchy that he sat at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And then we are told that he is much superior to the angels. In fact, his name is more excellent than theirs. When the writer talks about human beings, we are told that God made them, for a little while, he says, lower than the angels. So at least for a little while, you and I have to be content with being underneath the angels on the hierarchical scale, on God's scale. I guess that means we're under their wings, right? But at least we have authority over everything else. The writer points out that we humans have been crowned with glory and honor, and all things are subjected under our feet. Concerning this world, God left nothing outside our control. I guess that's a good thing. But then he goes back to Jesus. It's really interesting. He says that even Jesus, while he was wearing the skin of mortality, was made lower than the angels. Lower than the angels. But then, I guess through the resurrection, he was crowned with glory and honor. And I assume that his crown is a little better than our crowns, although Hebrews tells us that Jesus is not ashamed to call us his brothers and sisters. Anyway, the hierarchy in the book of Hebrews is very clear. You've got God at the top, and then followed by the Son, which is actually sitting at God's right hand. And then the angels, and then humanity, although humanity and the angels might switch at some point. And finally, everything else is underneath us. That's Hebrews. Now we get to the Gospel of Mark. And Mark gets at this hierarchy issue by talking about divorce of all things. The Pharisees come to Jesus and they want to know if he takes the law seriously. They want to know if he thinks that it is within the scope of the law, the Mosaic law, to get a divorce. And Jesus, of course, as he often does in his answers, he either answers with a question or he takes you around a little bit and finally get to his point, like I do in my sermons. But he goes back to the Genesis story, all the way back, which predates the law. Think about that. The Genesis story predates the law. He goes back to Genesis and he notes how the original male and female become one flesh. Notice how they become one flesh. And he says, because of this union, just common sense says, because of this union, divorce will lead to adultery for both men and women. Now that's a scary statement for those of us who have been divorced. However, most people agree that Jesus said this, he took such a hard-line stance against divorce because he was trying to protect women and children in that day and time. Because in the ancient world, if a man ditched his family, that family had really no way to support themselves. And so Jesus' condemnation of divorce meant something in that day which is not as true today, but it still has some truth to some degree, which is that women and children often suffer the most in the aftermath of a divorce. Regardless, implied in this lesson is the social hierarchy of men over women and children, and Jesus seems to have been very aware and sensitive to that and to the inherently oppressive nature of that kind of system, where you have someone who is up here and everybody else in the family is down here, which is natural, that's going to happen, but he's talking about the abuses of that kind of system. So we have to be real about this. Hierarchy will never go away. It's just part of human life. In fact, sometimes it's even necessary for the function of institutions and systems and all that. And theologically, there will also always be a hierarchy where you have divinity over humanity and humanity over the rest of creation, no matter where the angels fit in there, or they might someday. And in families, in family dynamics, there will always be one spouse at times that, wields more power than another, and parents over children and things of that nature. Just looking at the world in general, there will always be people at the top, however you want to measure that, with more money or power or whatever. People at the bottom, people in the middle, in whatever category we want to use. But what is important for us is that we do our best to make hierarchy less abusive and oppressive than it often has been or is. We have to do our best to make sure that there is less lording it over others. So with these new glasses, I saw another word that was kind of interesting this week for the very first time. It's a word that sounds like hierarchy, and that word is kyriarchy. Kyriarchy. This is a word coined by a theologian, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who's been around a long time, very famous. She noted how she coined the word kyriarchy, and she did it by connecting the word hierarchy and the Greek word kyrios. The word kyrios means Lord or master. And so kyriarchy means to lord it over those who are beneath you. So my point is, it's one thing to be in a hierarchy. Sometimes that just happens naturally, whether it be at church, at work, at home, at school, on the playing field, or whatever. There are natural hierarchies out there. It's one thing to be in a hierarchy. It's quite another thing to be part of a kyriarchy, which is a system where people lord it over others in a way that becomes abusive and oppressive. So don't be shy. Find your place in the hierarchy, but don't allow where you are in the hierarchy to become a kyriarchy. Treat everyone with respect and dignity. See everyone, whether you wear glasses or not, as being made in the image of God. Leave behind any and all power structures that are not rooted in love. And if you happen to see an angel, remember that someday we might be over them in the hierarchy. And won't that be cool? Amen.